For years, he has hidden away in palaces, crept through the halls of the Kremlin, and cowered in top-secret bunkers, so often shielded from view, barring the occasional public appearance where he is surrounded by security. Vladimir Putin has managed to protect himself from the pain that the Ukraine war has inflicted on his own country. But no more. Putin finally feels it as Russia is breaking from within, and he is powerless to stop it. And the reason why Putin is finally feeling it is that the war he started has hit Russia hard in the only place that he cares about, the pocketbook. According to Euromaidan Press, Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, growth was just 1% in 2025. For some, that may seem okay. GDP is still growing, right? However, that 1% comes off the back of the year 2024, where Russia's GDP grew by 4.3%, and 2023 where it grew by 4.1%. And to make matters even worse, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has predicted that Russia's GDP growth will likely top out at 0.8% for 2026, which is actually a decrease from its previous estimate of 1% growth. What we're seeing in these figures is a Russian economy that is stagnating and will soon collapse. Hilariously, Putin has tried to handwave everything that is happening. According to Russia's president, the GDP collapse is no surprise. It was all intentionally done in an effort to curb inflation, Putin says, which is a ridiculous claim that we will explore in more depth later in the video. What Putin isn't telling anybody is that issues across practically every economic sector in Russia are combining to lead to the GDP plunge, and there's not a lot that Putin can do to stop this cash-grabbing confluence unless he stops the Ukraine war. Putin isn't going to make the decision, and that means he is set to be standing atop Russia as he watches his country burn. There are a ton of factors that go into what Russia is experiencing right now. But the one that has socked Putin square on the jaw is that Russia's entire banking system is in crisis. Euromaidan Press says that the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, which is a Russian think tank that has direct ties to the Kremlin, published a report in January that is all doom and gloom for Putin. Right now, the report says, Russia's entire banking infrastructure has reached the point where it can be formally classified as being in a systemic crisis. What this means is that problem assets held by Russia's banks exceed 10% of total bank holdings. Problem assets are those that are on a bank's books that are in such serious trouble that the bank is unlikely to ever see a return from them. For example, banks invest in small and medium-sized businesses via loans and other financial vehicles. Right now, as the new Voice of Ukraine points out, 19% of all of Russia's small and medium-sized businesses are classified as problem assets, and it's not like the banks can simply cut and run from these assets. They have money tied up. If a bank cuts and runs, there's no chance of it receiving any return on its investment. There are other sectors in trouble. 6.1% of all of Russia's retail loans, which amount to 2.3 trillion rubles, or around $30.1 billion, are classified as problematic. The same goes for 11.2% of corporate loans provided by Russia's banks. That problem amounts to 10.4 trillion rubles, or about $136.3 billion, of investments that could go up in smoke for Russia's banks if all of these problematic loans are defaulted on. The Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting's report contains several other revelations. It says that there is a high risk of depositor flight if conditions in Russia get worse. And they will. Stick with us until later in the video, and you'll find out why. Depositor flight basically means debtors running from their problems, leaving their creditors in the dust. That happens to all banks every so often. But when 10% of Russia's debtors are all at high risk of flight, Putin has a burgeoning bank crisis on his hands. The same report also says that Russia's probability of entering a recession by July of 2026 is high. A recession amounts to negative GDP growth. So, not even one of Russia's most prominent Kremlin-linked economic think tanks believes that 0.8% growth in 2026 is possible. Putin is trying to spin all of this so fast that he's going to make himself sick. We mentioned earlier that Russia's president claims that these types of economic problems are man-made, as a means for Russia to curb rampant inflation. He even pointed to inflation going down to 5.6% by the end of 2025, which is indeed lower than the peak of 10.3% that Trading Economics reports that Russia faced back in March of that year. However, as the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, points out, Russia's inflation rate rocketed back up to 6.4% year-on-year in January 2026. Again, Putin says this is all to be expected. The rise in Russia's VAT rate from 20% to 22% is to blame this time around, and the inflation seen in the aftermath is just a short-term blip that will be corrected soon enough. Don't pay attention to how that increase in VAT was made necessary because Russia is earning a lot less revenue from a very important resource that we will reveal very soon. And definitely don't pay attention to the ISW report that Russian food inflation was up to about 25% both before and after that VAT hike. All that Russia's people need to know is that Putin is in complete control over everything. Trust your leader, not your eyes as they water at the sight of cabbage costing so much that you'll be eating nothing else for months. Of course, Putin's spin is all nonsense, especially when you take Russia's systemic banking crisis into account. The only way it could make any sort of sense is if Putin's plan is to put an end to banking in Russia altogether. It makes sense, we suppose. You can't have inflation when banks and money don't exist anymore. We're being facetious. Still, it's hard to take Putin's claim of purposefully engineering Russia's GDP collapse seriously when there are so many factors beyond his control that are behind all of this and will continue to get worse in the future. And one of those factors, as it always is when the subject of Russia's economy comes up, is oil. Guess what? Another Russian sales record has been broken in very much the wrong direction. On February 4, United 24 media reported that Russia's oil and gas tax revenues plummeted by a staggering 50% in January 2026 when compared to the same month in 2025. Russia still made $5.10 billion from oil and gas taxes, so it's not like the money has dried up completely. However, that $5.1 billion is the lowest that Russia has earned from its oil and gas in a single month since July 2020, which was during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. As for the broken record, $5.1 billion also amounts to just 2% of Russia's GDP. That is a record low during Putin's entire presidency, meaning that tax on oil and gas has always delivered more than 2% of Russia's GDP before. United 24 media then provides a quick-fire set of figures that showcase just how bad things have gotten for Russia in this particular industry. The key mineral extraction tax, NDP, has fallen nearly 60% compared to January 2025, while export duties have decreased by 44%. The price of Russian Urals oil dropped to $39 per barrel in December and $40 in January, significantly lower than the $59 assumed in the budget plan, the outlet says. Russia is also selling its Urals crude oil at a $27 discount compared to Brent crude, and it is preparing to ship about 30% less oil to India in 2026 as India grapples with sanctions issues related to its purchases of Russian oil. This is the collapse of an industry that we're watching in real time. And it matters because Russia doesn't survive without its oil and gas revenues, with the same going for Putin's war in Ukraine. There are a few reasons why Russia can't survive without the revenue it gets from these resources. As the International Energy Agency points out, revenue derived from taxing oil and gas sales constituted 45% of Russia's federal budget in 2021, which is the year before Putin launched the Ukraine war. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies adds that this sort of percentage is somewhat typical. It claims that Russia's oil and gas industry typically accounts for anywhere between 30% and 50% of the federal budget. In short, when oil and gas sales are low, less money goes into the federal budget on which Putin is relying to keep the Ukraine war going. The timing couldn't be worse for Putin. In addition to these revenue declines contributing to Russia's precarious overall financial position, as well as being the reason why Putin raised the VAT rate that he now claims is leading to rising inflation, Russia's budget isn't exactly healthy. On February 4, UNN reported that Russia's budget deficit could triple by the end of 2026, with the decline in Indian purchases of Russian oil being the major contributing factor. An unnamed source who is supposedly close to the Kremlin has suggested that Russia may generate 18% less revenue from oil and gas than the government anticipates, leading to a deficit somewhere between 3.5% and 4.4% of GDP. Remember that January's energy revenues amounted to 2% of GDP. When oil and gas play such a massive role in keeping the Russian economy afloat, any decline, even one that still sees Russia making billions from oil and gas sales, is important. A few $billion less per month means that Russia's Ukraine war effort weakens. It also means that Russia's people really start to feel the pain of Putin's war. And somehow, even amidst all of this doom and gloom for Russia, it looks like things are only going to get worse. But before we dig deeper into that, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. Subscribe today and be among the first to see videos like this when they go live. We've already talked about the slashing of Russia's GDP growth forecast by the IMF. According to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, that decline in GDP growth is very much linked to US sanctions, and Putin is set to face a lot more pain in that department soon. But before we get to that, there are plenty of other signs that Russia is only in the bad part of a bad to worse situation right now. Take Russian industry as an example. Trapped is the word that Euromaidan press uses to describe Russia's productive capacity. And it couldn't be more accurate. What Putin never seemed to foresee when he transformed Russia's economy into one that enormously relied on a booming defense sector is that the boom in defense would amount to declines almost everywhere else. That single sector swallowed up so much of Russia's labor that it has crippled any sort of industry that isn't directly related to Putin's attempts to destroy Ukraine. As the director of NPN Holdings, which is a Russian manufacturing company, told Skov, a regional radio, reviving Russian industry now seems impossible. No market, no credits, no ability to buy high-tech equipment. Even China, known for its industrial achievements, does not sell us metalworking equipment, Igor Savitsky ranted, adding, it's all because of sanctions. Savitsky is right about the state of Russian manufacturing. China and sanctions are all contributors to what has become a bust period for Russia's manufacturing activity. On December 29, the Moscow Times reported that Russia's manufacturing activity had declined for the seventh consecutive month. The evidence comes from S&P Global's Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI. According to the PMI scale, any value above 50 represents a growing sector. Russian manufacturing was at 48.3 on the PMI scale in November and had dropped again to 48.1 in December. Both months saw a decline, but the one in December was bigger than the one in November. In other words, Russia has a long way to go before its trapped industry can even start to recover. Weaker sales across the board were attributed to lower consumer confidence and falling purchasing power. We're sure that the VAT hike to 22% isn't going to do much to help either of those issues, even if Putin claims that what we're now seeing is all part of some grand plan. Manufacturing companies are also facing rising input costs, with those seen in December being the highest that they'd been since March, the Moscow Times added. Those higher expenses are being passed on to customers in the form of increased prices, which suggests we can cast more than a shadow of doubt on Russia's claimed inflation figures. There is some good news for Russia in this department. According to investing.com, January saw Russia's PMI rise to 49.4, which is the highest that it's been in 8 months. Manufacturing is still in decline. It was just a slower decline in January. Whether This means that Russia is hitting some sort of plateau, or it has enjoyed a brief moment of calm before an upcoming PMI storm is yet to be seen. Speaking about investing, there's also not a whole lot of that going on in Russia right now. That's according to Russia's own Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak, who said in a conversation with Russian senators that investment into Russia's economy is trending towards 0% by the end of 2025. Investment rose just 0.5% in the first 9 months of 2025. For the year, it will likely be 0 or slightly above, the Moscow Times reports. Novak is saying, yet again, this is a case of reality proving everything that Russia predicted wrong. September 2025 saw Russia's Ministry of Economic Development forecast investment growth of 1.7% by the end of 2025, but the third quarter of the same year saw Russia's Rosstat agency record the first decline in investment seen in Russia in 5 years. Specifically, a 3.1% decline in the third quarter of 2025 shows which way the wind is blowing for Russia on the investment front. What this means for Russia is that its companies aren't investing in the very industries that keep Russia running. The Moscow Times says that Russia's HSE Center for Development has noted investment declines in the transportation, construction, oil, gas, and coal sectors. The only sectors that remain somewhat strong on the investment front are the military-industrial complex and import substitution, which